Hey, I'm Ryan Zomorodi with Real Estate Skills, and today we've brought back a special guest, Tim, who's an employee at one of our companies who's very interested in learning how to wholesale real estate. If you want to get the contracts that we use to wholesale real estate, go ahead and check the link in the description so that you can download and use them to get the most out of today's video. So Tim, what would you like to learn about wholesale real estate contracts?
Absolutely everything. So as you know, I've never wholesaled in my life, you guys. I've never real estate invested in my life. Trying to get into wholesaling, and a big kind of hurdle, besides like talking to cash buyers, talking to agents, is the contract itself. And there's a lot of like legal stuff in here that kind of scares me. So right away, just to start at the very high level, what exactly is a wholesale real estate contract?
Yeah, so a wholesale real estate contract at its core is a real estate purchase agreement, which allows a buyer to purchase a property from a property owner who would be called the seller. And so once you have that formed, you want some specific terms in that purchase agreement which would allow that buyer to then sell their interest to a different buyer. And the goal is to make a fee for transferring your rights to somebody else, which is really essentially what a wholesale is. And so the contract you want to use is not just a typical purchase agreement, although at its essence it is. Mm-hmm. You want to have certain terms that's going to protect you as the buyer / wholesaler and allow you to enter this agreement favorably so that everyone's protected and that you can actually execute this wholesale profitably and safely so that your money is not at risk. So there can be multiple contracts involved depending on how you want to wholesale a property. So I think it's important to mention that wholesaling can mean different things to different people. Mm-hmm. There are multiple ways that you can wholesale a piece of real estate, right? Multiple ways you can wholesale houses. And depending on what strategy you want to use to wholesale, you're going to use different wholesale real estate contracts.
Right.
So, for example, there's the most common wholesale strategy is the assignment of contract method. There's also a double closing method, which uses a different set of contracts. And there's also an LLC assignment method as well, which is a completely different set of contracts as well. Of course, there's some overlap, but it's just important to understand what strategy are you using, and therefore you can get the right paperwork in place to execute on that strategy.
Right. And would it be kind of safe to say then, like, assignment of contract is the most like beginner friendly closing process out of all three of those that you just mentioned?
I would say that, yeah, the assignment of contract is generally what we teach our students first and foremost, because there's no closing costs involved to the wholesaler. Mm-hmm. And it's really just the most straightforward way to wholesale real estate. And it's very simple as far as the paperwork involved.
Okay. Yeah. It's pretty common then among beginners like me, hopefully, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's generally what we prescribe as far as if it's your first time wholesaling real estate, if you're just getting started in wholesaling houses, the assignment of contract method is absolutely the way that we would recommend doing it at first.
Right.
There is another method. It's using what we'd call an independent consultant agreement. Mm-hmm. And so, again, just trying to reinforce that there are many ways to do it. So a lot of people just categorize wholesaling in one bucket. But today we're going to really be focusing on some of the main strategies like the assignment of contract. Cool. And even we'll touch on double closing as well.
Yeah, because for me, haven't done it before, easier is better, simpler is better. So I'd love to kind of leave today kind of just having a good backing, a good like piece of confidence that I could actually tackle filling one of these out and hopefully making my first wholesale deal as well, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll cover everything today from, how to fill out these contracts. We've designed this to be very wholesale friendly. And so we'll go through it later, line by line as much as you want to so that you can fill it out on your own. Our audience can absolutely fill it out on their own by the end of this. But more importantly, understand what it is, because I know it's very intimidating probably looking at this. It's just a bunch of legal jargon at the end of the day. But what this is and what I want you to really emphasize in your mind, this mind shift is your mindset shift is that this is a money-making tool.
Right.
These sheets of paper can make, $5, 10, 20, $50,000, maybe even over six figures in profit per deal if you structure it and you know how to work these pieces of paper the right way. So wholesaling is all about the contracts. And so the more you understand about these pieces of paper, the more empowered you're going to be to successfully close deals.
You can see why it scared me a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
Well, here we go. Let's get right into it. So you mentioned assigning the contract is the closing process, the most common, most beginner friendly. On a high level, can you just kind of walk me through that process step by step?
Absolutely. So again, it all starts with the real estate purchase and sale agreement. So there's other names for it. Purchase and sale agreement is abbreviated PSA. A lot of the times it might just be PA for purchase agreements, real estate sales agreement. So there's a lot of different names. You might hear offer contract, purchase contract. These are all interchangeable in the real estate world. So you might hear different names, especially if you're in other states, different markets. There's going to be specific names, especially for the realtor approved contracts, that are going to sound different in depending on what location you're in. So the contract we'll review today is a more standard agreement that we've used in multiple states across the country. It's a real general contract to use, and it's called the Real Estate Purchase and Sale Agreement. So what that does is that is a legally binding agreement between a buyer and a property owner, which memorializes the agreement to sell the property. And it will discuss different terms, such as the parties involved, right? The buyer and the seller, the terms of the agreement. The main terms of that agreement is the purchase price, the earnest money deposit amount, the timelines involved, right? How quickly you're going to be closing on the sale of the property. Obviously, you want to name the property at question, so
Right.
the address, the assessor's parcel number. So really just the details of the property itself. And then the terms of the sale. So are you paying cash? Is this a subject to transaction? Is this seller financed? Are you getting a loan, traditional loan? So generally with wholesale transactions, you're going to be offering cash. And that's how we're able to provide distressed sellers with the speed and convenience of knowing that they're going to be closing and receiving cash to their bank account. So generally wholesalers are offering cash or a cash equivalent when they're buying these pieces of real estate. Oftentimes these houses that we're buying below market value do not even qualify for conventional financing, right? First time home buyer loans, traditional Fannie Freddie type of financing. These properties are in such distressed shape that they are really meant for a cash offer. So
Right.
So without going too much in the weeds, first you have the purchase and sale agreement, which now once you have the buyer's signature and the seller's signature on, that is really a meeting of the mind saying, me as the buyer, I'm willing to buy this property, and the seller agrees to sell it to me under the terms of the agreement. Now, what happens when you wholesale the property is that if you are the wholesaler as the buyer, you're now finding a different buyer to replace yourself on the contract.
Right.
So that another buyer who might be an investor looking to add another deal to their portfolio of rentals or looking to buy, fix, and sell a property for a nice profit, right? The classic fix and flip.
Yeah.
You want to partner with other investors who you can now assign the contract to, which means you're now transferring your rights to buy this property to somebody else. And that individual or company can now purchase this property under the same terms of that purchase and sale agreement. So what the assignment agreement does, it's an agreement that is between you and the next buyer, right? We call them an end buyer, a cash buyer. So someone else who's going to be replacing yourself on that contract, and everything else on that agreement stays the same. So what the assignment agreement does is it's executed after the purchase and sale agreement. So once you're under contract with the seller, you've secured the right to buy that property. You're now using an assignment contract to effectively transfer your rights to somebody else who can now slide in and close on that deal and give the seller what your original purchase price is. But then on the assignment contracts, you can now add an assignment fee on top of it. So they can pay you an assignment fee for the rights to buy that property.
Got it. Okay. So let me try to review it. Correct me if I'm wrong, which I will be. Are you ready for this? Okay. So the purchase and sale agreement basically just says I now have the rights to purchase this house. The seller is like, yeah, that's cool. You have the rights to buy my house. I'm not actually buying it. I'm going to wholesale it to another cash buyer. And that's what this is for, the assignment addendum. I'm basically saying I'm not actually buying it. This guy is. And then everything is good after that. I've wholesaled the property, hopefully, if all of this is right. And then the fee I get is stated in the assignment addendum.
Correct. So with a purchase agreement, so when you enter into a purchase agreement, you are the buyer on the contract. Now, so the purchase agreement states that you, Tim, are buying this piece of real estate.
Okay.
So you are
That's where
now
I got it
the
wrong.
actual
Yeah.
buyer on that contract. So until you assign the contract, you are the buyer. You're saying, hey, I'm buying this property
Got it.
under the conditions of this contract. Now, there are ways to get out of that contract, which we always want to have present in the contract, which we can agree in a bit. But until you assign the contract, you're technically the buyer and you're saying, hey, seller, I am buying your property. So it is a legally binding agreement to some extent. And once you assign it, now you're technically not a party to the transaction anymore. You are considered the assignor and the buyer is the assignee, meaning they have received the assignment of the purchase agreement and they can slide in and now close that deal with the seller. They are now the buyer. So you're essentially removing yourself as the buyer and you're in many cases completely off the hook for whatever happens in that purchase agreement because there's a new buyer who assumes all of the responsibility, the financial burden, the potential consequences of not performing that contract. So if you structure it the right way, like we have in these contracts, you will now be able to remove yourself from the deal and carve out a fee for assigning the contract to a different buyer.
Got it. So that's where I was kind of confused. It's like, okay, am the buyer in this sense, and everything's being transferred through this thing.
Yeah, exactly. So even though you might have an intention of wholesaling the property, in order to truly control the deal and actually secure an interest in being able to wholesale the property, you need to become the buyer.
Got it.
So we always encourage our students and people that we work with to really take the position that they are real estate investors, because really like nearly everyone we work with, they essentially want to become property owners. And, part of real estate investing is sending offers, it's analyzing deals, it's sometimes wholesaling as well. And so if you really take the position of, hey, I'm a real estate investor, I'm buying these properties, then, you can really own the fact that you are making these offers to purchase.
Right.
So you do truly have that intent.
Got it.
Because otherwise, then it's kind of a flimsy contract if you're not really able to perform on it, right? You want to be that buyer, and ultimately, you may want to wholesale it, which is where the assignment comes in. And when you're double closing it, which we can talk about, you actually are buying it. You're just immediately reselling it. So
okay, yeah. Can you highlight double closing then? Because I'm sure I'll come up, in that situation probably more than likely, right? At some point in my wholesale career. So assigning is just these pieces of paper, buyer, wholesaler, seller. So double closing. Can you kind of highlight that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's double closing is a different type of wholesale where you essentially you sign the same real estate purchase and sale agreement, but then you actually sign another one with your end buyer. So instead of assigning that original purchase agreement to a different buyer, you're now signing a second purchase and sale agreement with you as the seller and your end buyer as the buyer on that agreement. So you now have
two of these,
yes.
two of the purchase agreements.
So you now have two purchase agreements. There's no assignment contracts involved. And so on the first one, they call it the AB contract in kind of the wholesale realm. The AB contract is between you and the seller. And then the BC contract is between you and the end buyer, right? So you're the seller. And there are some terms you're going to want to include in both contracts to make sure that the timelines are lining up correctly so that you're closing on the same day, and you can ultimately line them up perfectly so where you don't have any risk involved as far as your earnest money deposits and your contingencies. So there's ways that we advise people how to structure both contracts to ensure that you don't have any risk in the deal.
Got it. A little bit of clarification on double closing then. Am I using my money to buy the property then and then selling it again? Or is it the same kind of wholesale process where it's like none of my money technically is being used at all? Like that's kind of a little bit confusing for me. So yeah.
No, great question. So there are ways to do it without any of your own money.
Yeah.
We recently closed a few deals actually that we didn't put up $1 of our own money to close the deals, even with the double closing. So there's ways to do it where you can use the end buyer's funds to completely fund the whole deal. And you don't even have to take out a loan or transactional lending. You don't have to take out a hard money loan or use any of your own cash. So there are absolutely ways that you can double close a property without any of your own money.
Right.
And again, I don't know if I touched on this, but you actually are closing on the property and then immediately reselling it.
Yeah.
Sometimes moments later, really on the same day is typically how you want to structure it. So you'll actually show up on title as the owner, and within the same day, you're now the seller of that same property, and your end buyer is now going to be on the title.
Got it. So like because it's such a it should be like a quick process of that transfer. Technically, you do have the funds because it's technically just their funds, right? So I bought it, but like, hours later, he buys it from me. So the money's still getting to that original seller just as fast, pretty much, because we're kind of working together.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Right. So you would basically line up the two closings. So there's literally two closings that happen.
Right.
The first closing is the original purchase contract, and the second closing is between you and your cash buyer. And so if you structure it the right way, then your cash buyer's funds will go to the title company, and then they will actually use that money to close the first transaction. And so whatever the difference is your profit.
Right.
So if you have the first purchase agreement for $350,000 to buy a piece of real estate, and your second purchase agreement is for $400,000 to sell it to your cash buyer, they're going to fund $400,000 to the title company, and plus closing costs, and then you will then be able to take that money. The title company will use that money to then fund the first transaction, pay the original seller their $350,000 plus closing costs, and then whatever is the difference is your profit. So then they will send you a wire or a check for the difference, which is $50,000 minus closing costs. So that's essentially double closing. You're receiving a profit from the difference of the two sales prices. With the assignment of contract method, you're earning a fee. You're earning an assignment fee, and you're never actually on the transaction as far as on the title, because you never become the owner of the property in an assignment of contract deal.
Right. So in terms of like, let's just cover like assignment of contract versus like double closing, right? So in a double closing, you would never really need this thing then, realistically.
Correct.
Because you're not assigning it to anybody. You're buying it and reselling it immediately. Okay,
There'd be two purchase agreements with a double closing.
Got it.
So that's where the name double closing comes from.
Yeah.
Because you're actually, it's basically flipping a property.
Yeah.
Right? They call it wholesaling, but you're actually flipping the property. But you're closing on it and then just immediately reselling it the same day. So you don't really own it for any extended period of time.
Right.
Might be the next day where you're selling it, but usually it's on the same day.
What kind of situations would you say that might be what you have to do? Because it seems like a slightly more complicated. I know probably to you isn't, but to me it's like, oh my gosh, like buy, sell, like double close. So like what kind of situations do you think that I should look out for where a double closing would have to be like a essential thing to do?
Yeah, so the most common reason you want to double close is that you don't want to disclose your assignment fee to your end buyer. So if you scored a great deal and you can realistically charge your end buyer a $50,000 wholesale fee or even a $100,000 wholesale fee, which I've seen before, then they might push back and say, hey, I don't want to pay you that much money. Like that's a lot. And so with a double closing, they're only seeing the purchase price that you're presenting to them.
Right.
Whereas with an assignment contract, they'll see your assignment fee when you actually when they sign that assignment contract. So it reduces friction, and it just kind of it disguises your profit in the deal.
Right. Why wouldn't you always double close then?
There are some differences because typically you're paying closing costs. So there's two sets of closing costs because there's two transactions. So the benefit of assignment contracts is that you are getting the full amount of your assignment fee because that's just paid to you directly without any closing costs factored in. When you assign that purchase agreement to a different buyer, they're paying those closing costs because they're now the buyer. And a lot of times investors offer to pay all of the closing costs for sellers. And so that might not always be the case, but generally there are going to be some closing costs. So when you do double close, you're both the buyer and the seller. So there's going to be some, transfer taxes. There's going to be some, title fees, escrow fees, recording fees, notaries, things like that involved, which will then chip away at your profit. So,
got it. Okay.
So that's why if you're going to double close, you're generally going to want to have a bigger profit, $20,000, $30,000 or more to really make up for some of the fees that you're going to incur.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So you kind of want to gauge, okay, I'm going to get let's just say a really large wholesale fee if I double close, but I have to make sure that the fees involved kind of outweigh if I would have just done this, kind of a thing. So if my wholesale fee ends up being smaller, say like 10 grand or 5 grand, it's kind of better to do this just so you're not hit with all these fees,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's really the main reason. Other reasons also is if you have a purchase and sale agreement that is explicitly states that you cannot assign the contract, maybe the seller when you enter the contract says, hey, there's no assignments involved. Sometimes you might be dealing with a bank that is particularly strict about assignments. Those situations, contracts are generally assignable unless they state in the contract that you cannot assign it.
Got it.
And even when they state that you can't assign it, you can always amend it later. So I think that's a little bit of a misconception that, hey, my contract is not assignable, so I can't assign the contract. You can always amend it. However, there may be a situation where you just can't assign it or you just don't want to assign it for one reason or another. Then you can just simply double close, and now you're not having to assign that contract.
Got it.
So that's the second reason. The third reason, which I've actually run into, is that if you're wholesaling a property, wholesaling a house in a different state, sometimes when you buy and sell a property, that state may impose a tax withholding from the proceeds of the sale. So this is getting a little bit in the weeds with it, but we recently bought and sold a property in Colorado, and we're in California. I never saw the property, I've never even been to Denver.
Yeah.
So we bought and sold the property. We did a double closing, or we were planning to do a double closing. And title let me know that, hey, we're actually going to withhold 2% of the sales price from your net proceeds. So on a $460,000 sale, so when we sold it to the cash buyer, they were going to withhold 2%, which I think was like $9,000 or $10,000.
That's a lot, yeah.
So we were like, we don't want that to happen. So let's just structure it as an assignment. So we ended up doing an assignment.
Oh, okay.
And so that way we didn't have any tax withholding. So, a little bit in the weeds, but that is something to look into if you're virtually wholesaling, if you're wholesaling at a distance in other states. It's good to talk to title companies to ask, hey, are there any tax withholdings for foreign entities? So our company was a California company. We're doing business in Colorado, or some other states have this too, and they will actually withhold some of the proceeds of the sale, and they'll basically hold that money hostage for a year or so until you file taxes, and then they'll give you a refund later based on what you actually owe in taxes. So it's just, they'll just take your money and hold it to make sure you file your taxes in that state. So they get their tax revenue.
How common would you say that is?
I only saw it in this state. So
Okay.
I'd
Yeah,
only,
yeah.
I'd be,
And you've been wholesaling for years now, so it's
yeah,
like, yeah.
yeah. So with regards to the double closing, it'll only happen in that situation where you're selling a
Right.
property
Mm-hmm.
in a wholesale scenario. So I've done most of my wholesales as assignments or using a independent consultant agreement and just invoicing the buyer directly and getting paid directly. So those situations, it's just like you're earning income. Whereas when you're buying and selling a property in a short period of time, that's considered capital gains.
Right.
So there's a whole like tax complication when you're buying and selling a piece of real estate. You're actually your revenue, your income on your tax return is actually the entire price of the property, and your cost of goods sold is what you paid for that property. So there's a whole different, tax philosophy and how you're going
Yeah.
to actually report that on your tax returns when you're double closing. So
Right. Mm-hmm.
when you're earning assignment fees, it's a lot more simple because you're just like, hey, I earned 20K here,
Yeah.
5K here.
Whereas this, it's like you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars. Most
Exactly.
Of the time.
Yeah. You'll look at
Yeah.
your tax return and say, I made millions in gross revenue, but then you have all these costs of goods sold. So
Yeah.
it's yeah.
I mean, it's good that you're teaching me kind of both avenues because like there's always like a plan B now, technically.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so you mentioned a third option though, and just to be super thorough, can you kind of cover? I think it was LLCs or
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in this scenario, let's say you put a property under contract using the same purchase and sale agreement, and you either put it under contract under your LLC. We say, hey, Tim Home Buyers LLC is the buyer on the purchase agreement. You can now, instead of assigning the contract, instead of double closing, you are now assigning your LLC to a buyer for a fee. So you might sell your LLC for $20,000 to the end buyer. And this way, the buyer never changes on the contract and you're not assigning any contracts. You're just selling your LLC. And one of the assets of that LLC is the purchase agreement.
Okay.
So this is a purchase agreement, which is considered, an asset of whoever is the buyer on that contract. So you can simply assign your LLC. The membership interests of your LLC can be sold to the buyer instead. So this completely goes around any local wholesaling laws about assigning contracts or dealing with contracts, assignments. And so you're now not even marketing or selling the contract, you're marketing and selling your LLC.
Yeah.
And so to my knowledge, there's no state wholesaling laws, whether you're in Illinois or South Carolina,
Yeah.
like there's no laws that prohibit you from selling an LLC
Yeah.
or marketing or advertising an LLC. So if you structure it that way, you're now just selling your LLC for a
Right.
fee.
Yeah.
And so the new buyer can take over your LLC and they can either close on that property under the same terms and price as the purchase agreement, or they can reassign that contract to their own LLC and close in their LLC. So it gives them options, but ultimately that's one way you can structure it through an LLC assignment. And, we work with some attorneys that even if you have it under your personal name, because you can still wholesale under your name as an individual, even if you don't yet have an LLC. And while you're under contract, you can work with an attorney to form an LLC specifically for this purpose. They call it a single purpose entity. And they'll form the LLC within 24 or 48 hours.
I was about to ask how long that takes.
Very quickly. It might cost $300, just the state filing fees and maybe a nominal fee to the attorney.
Yeah.
And then you can assign it to yourself, which there's really never any issues assigning a contract to yourself, even if the contract doesn't allow assignments because it's yourself. It's a wholly owned entity by Tim.
Right.
So why wouldn't they say yes to that, right? It's you at the end of the day and you can prove it.
Yeah.
So once you assign it to that LLC, you can now have a different agreement with your end buyer that basically is selling that LLC. And that buyer should be pretty confident because you just formed the LLC. It's completely clean. You don't even really need an EIN, right? An employer identification number, like a tax ID. You don't even need a bank account for that entity. It's just very clean. It's just a shell that you're now assigning to a new buyer. So that's the third strategy. It's less common, but it's a great tool to have in your arsenal.
Yeah, I imagine in like certain states, it's like you would have to have it if you want to like continue wholesaling, right? So
Totally.
seems a little complicated for my taste. Thankfully I'm in
Yeah.
California, which I'm pretty sure I could just use purchase and sale agreement and the assignment contract as well. So let's just say like I've done this for a while. Let's just say I'm kind of like you, where I'm in California, but I want to wholesale, nationwide in another state. So do these contracts kind of vary state by state? It seems like from what you were telling me, there's a lot of like state regulations like on wholesaling in general. So I imagine the contracts for wholesaling changes in every state too.
Yeah, certainly. So every state is different as far as the realtor approved contracts that are available to the public. So every state has their own realtors association, and they all have approved forms that have been reviewed by attorneys, and they generally get updated, if not every year, every few years, because things change, new requirements are in play. So every state pretty much has their own realtor approved contract, which is something that if you're pursuing on-market properties, if you're working with real estate agents, they're usually required to use those contracts, which those are totally fine. And I really like realtor contracts. You just have to, again, like understand them. And
Right.
there's a lot of protections built in there for both buyer and seller. So those are great, and they do vary. A lot of them are available online as well, but usually like there's a little bit of a gatekeeping involved. So you have to go through realtor to get those contracts. In most states. So I've seen a few states where you can just get them online. But as far as like having a more general, like wholesale friendly contract, what we have here that we're, going over today is more general, that you can use nationwide.
Oh, okay.
And is
Nice.
really catered specifically to wholesaling the way it's written. And we can go over some of those clauses and how it protects wholesalers. So that's really regarding the purchase agreements, right? The assignment contracts, there's a few states like California that have realtor approved assignment contracts. So, some people might say, is wholesaling illegal, or is assigning contracts
Right.
illegal?
Yeah.
Like when a realtor organization has an assignment addendum specifically used for assignments, then of course it's not illegal, right? Wholesaling's fully legal,
yeah.
and it's just a part of real estate, part of the whole ecosystem. California has something called an assignment of agreement addendum. The CAR form AOAA is the abbreviation. And that's what, if you're using a realtor purchase agreement, you're going to want to use that same assignment addendum just because they go hand in hand.
Got it.
Now, there's not many other states that have specific assignment addendums or assignment agreements for the realtor purchase agreement. So what you can do in those situations is use an assignment addendum like the one that we have here in the resource that everybody can download. Is you can use something like this. I actually just used this the other week in a wholesale deal. When we used the realtor purchase and sale agreement, there wasn't a specific assignment addendum. Most states don't have that.
Right.
So you can use just a general assignment addendum like the one we have right here to then assign that purchase agreement. So again, it's very rare that states have specific realtor-approved assignment addendums. So you're just going to want a general assignment addendum.
Yeah, that kind of catch-all that works for everything.
Exactly.
Yeah,
We've used this in multiple states. Title companies have approved it. I actually have a check right here that we just cashed using this exact assignment addendum. So,
how much is that for?
This is $18,750 from an assignment. So, using this exact contract.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So it's money, like you said, right? This is the gateway, right?
It sure is. It sure is. There were two contracts involved. It was like the Colorado state approved, realtor approved purchase agreement, and then we used this exact assignment addendum, sent them both to the title company, and within a matter of a few weeks of closing, a few days after closing, we received a check in the mail. So,
wow, that's awesome. Yeah. So before we kind of deep dive into you helping me fill this out, kind of line by line, really quick, you mentioned realtor specific or realtor state specific purchase and sale agreements. Would you recommend that new wholesalers always try to find that realtor approved one, or is this one like just as valid pretty much 100% of the time too?
Yeah, I would say it depends on where the individual's at in their journey. If
Got
you're
it.
just like starting to learn about contracts, the realtor
Yeah.
contract is much longer than this. It's probably like, 12 pages or
Oh wow.
more.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more language. So I would always recommend like new wholesalers, if you're just getting started in real estate wholesaling, and maybe this is your first time looking at a wholesale real estate contract, check this one out, because this is a good foundation. It has everything you need to actually wholesale a house, wholesale a property. And we're going to explain what this is. And this is a good foundation because a lot of the clauses here are going to translate to every other contract. But there's going to be local disclosures, local inclusions in the state-specific contracts that are important once you've decided on a market. Once you are ready to start sending offers using those contracts, I always recommend getting your hands on one of those contracts and then read it line by line, read it 5 times, highlight the clauses that you're not sure about what that means. Talk to someone like myself, talk to people in our community, talk to a real estate agent, talk to a real estate broker or an attorney, and just get clear on what it is, because the more you understand about your wholesale real estate contract, the more empowered you're going to be, the more confident you're going to be in pursuing these properties and locking these deals up, and the more money you're going to be able to make,
Right.
because you know how this contract works. At the end of the day, this is an agreement that these transactions, really rely on. These are like instructions for how the transaction is going to go. So the more you know about how to use these, the better off you're going to be in structuring these deals and, and making sure everyone's happy. The seller's needs are met at the same time in this contract.
Right.
So
yeah.
So
kind of everything we talked about, in my video with Alex, the step-by-step process, negotiating with the buyers and the sellers. At the end of the day, all of it has to be on paper, and basically these 2 things in front of us. So let's say I have a cash buyer. I talk to a seller of property. They're down. We negotiate a price. This is probably the next step to do in front of us, the purchase and sale agreement, right? So they're selling me the property. So if we can just kind of line by line go through this, and just so I don't miss anything and, don't get sued or whatever.
Sure.
I look like an idiot when I filled out wrong.
No, absolutely. Yeah, let's take a look at it. So, this is really geared for direct to seller contracts, right? So usually if you're offering on market properties, you get the luxury of having a realtor complete this for you.
Yeah.
So whether it's a listing agent, you have another buyer's agent representing you, they're going to complete the contracts for you. So that's one of the benefits of offering on market properties. So, this contract is great for direct to seller negotiations and wholesaling.
Yeah.
So
I'll market like anything on like the MLS and like Redfin.
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
The multiple listing service, Redfin, Zillow, Realtor.com, anything listed on the local MLS, listed by a real estate agent.
Yeah.
Those are on market properties. So anything like direct to seller that's not listed on the MLS, where you might be, door knocking, or, you might have a friend or family who's looking to sell their house, then, you could always use this contract with them directly. If you're not sure how to use like a real estate realtor approved contract.
Yeah. So just to clarify, they're filling this out, not me.
So if you're going to be using this contract, you'd be filling this out. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
You'd want to fill this out when you're working directly with the seller.
Okay.
So
got it. Okay.
Yeah, the seller definitely wouldn't be filling this out. You want to act with authority. You want to act with intelligence and confidence when filling this out, when you're working with a seller. What I meant is that when you're pursuing a property that's listed with a real estate agent, you're going to want to use one of the realtor contracts.
Right. Okay.
So
got it.
And a lot of times the real estate agents will actually fill it out for you.
Yeah. But in this case, I'm filling this out.
Yeah.
When it's the seller and myself, which is pretty common, I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. So I guess walk me through it. Forgive me if I stop you for any questions, but let's just start at the top.
Perfect. Yeah, so let's just start at the top. There's a notice that just is a little bit of a disclosure. Number one is where you want to list the parties to the agreement. So the seller, the name of the seller, and keep in mind that there might be multiple sellers involved in a deal, right? If there's husband and wife, if there's multiple
Right.
family members, it's very important to get all of the sellers who own the property on this agreement.
Got it.
Because if one party is not on here and their signature's not on here, then your contract might be completely invalid, right? It's going to be
Pro
worthless.
tip, everyone.
Yeah,
All the
so
sellers.
make sure you talk to a title company, do a little bit of research online. You can find who is on title to the property. It might be an LLC, it might be a company, it might be a trust. So regardless, you want to make sure you have the full and complete name of the owners of the property on the purchase agreement, and you get all of the appropriate signatures.
Got it.
There's a line for, social security number, tax ID. So that's optional, just if you want to make sure you have the correct selling information, as well as the mailing address, right? The residence address of the sellers is where you can put right here, not the address of the property in section number one. Following that is the buyer's information. So if you're the one who's buying the property, you would put your name here or your company name here. That's where that would go next to buyer. There's also an important line right underneath that, which says, buyer's name and his, her, or their entities, successors, and or assigns. So this clause essentially allows you to assign the contract without any resistance, without any question. And like I said earlier, all contracts are assignable by default. However, having this in here, just make sure there's no question. Like, it's very clear as day that, you're the buyer on the contract. However, it might be your assignee that is going to ultimately be the buyer. So whoever you might designate to be the assignee of this contract is also the buyer, and the seller is agreeing to that.
Got it. So the buyer line's myself and my cash buyer, technically.
You would just put your name here, you as the buyer.
Okay.
The line underneath just gives you a really explicit right to either assign it to somebody else, or you might change the name to a different LLC.
Oh, okay, yeah,
So
I see.
if you have a successor, right, like if you passed away when you're under contract,
Yeah.
right, your successor would now have the right to this contract.
Got it, okay.
Or your or assigns, right? So it's basically, Tim and or whoever you assign the contract to.
Got it.
And this generally doesn't come up a lot, but if the seller ever questions it, then you would just say, hey, we have multiple LLCs. I'm not sure which entity we want to take title in. It might be my trust. It might be my, my rehab entity. It might be my rental LLC. So depending on what strategy we decide to use, then we're going to just close in a certain LLC. We haven't decided on that yet, so that's why that's in here.
Right, okay.
So very,
sense.
very common thing that
Yeah.
can occur. Next is the address. So this is the address of the buyers. So this is, if you have a mailing address, you would just want to put that here. You don't always have to put this in contracts to make them enforceable. It's just to be very clear as to who are the parties on this contract, and then ultimately how to get in touch with these individuals, the mailing address of those. Under that's just another disclosure, just stating the intention behind the contract as well between the buyer and the seller, that they are agreeing to this deal under the price and terms in this contract. Number 2 is the real property to be purchased. So this is something that you want to make sure is completely accurate. This is the subject property. This is the property that you're looking to purchase and wholesale using this wholesale real estate contract. So here you just put your street address, city or town, county, state, zip, and 2C is described as. So what does that mean? That's where you put your property identification number, PIN number, or your assessor's parcel number, APN. So what is that? That is essentially the tax ID for the property itself. So in every municipality, in every county, there's a county assessor's office, which is the organization that levies property taxes. And so they assign a specific unique number to each parcel so that they can keep track of it for the sake of real estate transactions, for property tax assessments, for property listings as well. If a real estate agent's going to list a property, they can type in the APN into the tax system, into the listing system, and then it'll automatically populate a lot of the property information. So you would want to just put your the property's APN, which you can simply look up on the county website.
Oh, okay.
You can look up the tax information, or you can also look it up on Redfin, Zillow, the MLS.
Okay.
It's pretty easy to find.
I was about
that.
to ask like how to get that and like how long would it take if I need to like go to a person, but if everything's online, then that's great.
Yeah,
nice.
Very easy to find.
Yeah.
It's right on the Redfin listing.
Awesome. Yeah.
That you can find within seconds of
Cool.
looking up a property. Yep. So number 3 is included in sales price. So this is essentially stating that everything on this piece of land that's permanently attached to the land, right, including the structure itself, right, the house that you're looking to wholesale and purchase, as well as everything that's considered permanently affixed to the property, like the flooring, the walls, the roof, the air conditioning, the furnace, the landscaping, mailbox, the pool and spa equipment, all the carpet, etc. So it's basically all real property is included in the purchase price.
Right.
So there's a difference between real property and personal property. So personal property is basically everything that you can remove readily that's not
like
permanently
your couch
attached.
and
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Furniture would be personal property.
Yeah.
Anything that's like in storage, obviously like cars,
Yeah.
things like that. So those can also be negotiated in the sale. They would just have to be listed in the next section, which says additional personal property, if any, to be included. That's where you could list things like, hey, I really love that motorcycle. Let's include that in the sale.
And he's like, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Cool.
or furniture, right? So you might be buying a property that you want to Airbnb. Then you might want to have it furnished when you buy it, or you really like a chandelier that's already on the property. So sometimes you can specify certain things, as well as appliances. So that's what you also want to specify as well. Here it's in that section, it says built-in appliances, but a lot of times owners are attached to their refrigerator, right? They might have splurged on a really nice refrigerator. Yeah. So it's good to specify what of that personal property that you'd like to have included.
I see. I actually didn't know you could do that. So real property is just basically everything that's on the lot that you can't physically remove with your hands unless you're Superman or something, like. And then personal property is like, you're like your furniture, personal belongings, like mementos, things like that. Got it. Cool.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And so there's a list here, pretty specifically. So like, for example, some sellers might want to remove their curtain rods and their drapery, right? So they might specify that is excluded here.
Got it. Okay.
And then the next line, there's no leased property, no leased personal property except. So if there's anything that's leased that's not specified, you would just include that there. So a little bit less commonly used there. So section 4 is really important. This is the purchase price. So one of the most important elements to a purchase agreement is the purchase price. So you'd simply put the price there, and then the next lines is really how that purchase price will break down as far as when that amount is being paid. Now, so lines 4A and B are essentially the earnest money deposit. So when you form a contract, you're going to want to include an earnest money deposit. That might be as low as $500, $1,000. Sometimes it's as much as 1 to 3% of the purchase price, or maybe even the entire purchase price, right? So 4A would be if you're submitting the earnest money, the initial deposit with the purchase contract, you would put that amount there. I never really do that. More common that I see is 4B, where you'd say it says purchase price is payable as follows by additional deposit due upon seller's acceptance. So that just means if and when the seller accepts the purchase agreement, so when they sign and they accept it, that's when you're going to be paying this initial deposit.
Got it.
So that's more common with these contracts. So I would forget 4A, and then 4B is where you'd put your earnest money deposit. And then 4C is if you're going to be getting a loan, any kind of financing involved in the purchase, you would put that loan amount in 4C. So if you're putting 80% as a loan, 20% down, then you could put the 80% of the purchase price on that line as kind of like your financed amount. But again, if you're offering all cash, which most wholesalers are going to be offering with cash, you wouldn't have to put anything on that line. 4D is if you're going to be taking taking ownership of the project of the property subject to the seller's existing financing, subject to deal of approximately however much that loan balance is. So if the seller owed, $50,000 and you wanted to take over the property subject to the existing financing, you would just put that approximate amount on that line, stating that I'm using that to contribute to the overall purchase price. Mm-hmm. Now, 4E is where you can state cash. So there's a line there. It says, 4E by, I would just put in big capital letters cash. So you really just emphasize that this is a cash deal. This is not a finance transaction. Again, one of the benefits of working with wholesalers, with real estate investors, that we offer all cash deals. So in most cases, you would just basically put the entire purchase price minus whatever you put as your deposit on that line on 4E. So you do cash, and then whatever that is not in your earnest money deposit, you would put it there. And then balance to be paid by certified check or bank check at closing. So if there's anything remaining, then you would go ahead and put that there. And then finally, at the end, you just put the purchase price again. So it should all equal up to that purchase price.
Right, okay.
Once you filled that out.
Yeah. So 4 just by itself, purchase price, and then everything kind of broken down as to what that purchase price is, and then finally, again, the purchase price and total price to be paid.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So just breaking down how's that purchase price going to be funded at the end of the day. It's regarding your funding of the deal. So again, one of the benefits of working with investors is it is all cash. There's no financing in place because that can cause some complications. If the buyer doesn't get approved for that financing, then that could risk the deal. It could allow them to back out and not close. So Section 5 really just concerns the deposits that we stated above. So it's just basically stating that the deposits should be given to the listing broker or an attorney, a title company, or an escrow company. So one thing that's very important is you do not want to give your earnest money deposit directly to the seller. So you're going to want to have a title company facilitate this transaction, facilitate the closing of this wholesale deal. And so they're going to handle all the funds. Money shouldn't exchange directly to the seller in most cases, right? Yeah. You can do a deal like that, but it's just it makes people more comfortable, and there's a neutral third party involved facilitating this contract. So this really just states that the deposit should be paid to a title company or someone else who's a third party, not directly to the seller in general. It also states that if the buyer does not submit that deposit, it gives the seller cancellation rights. So you can't just tie up a contract and just not put in the deposit. It allows the seller the right to give you a notice that says, hey, you didn't submit your deposit. I'm going to now cancel after 3 days if you don't submit this deposit.
Got it. I'm going to pause the contract for a second. Are there any other instances where a seller would want to cancel? I mean, that's a pretty big one. It's like, oh, you don't have the money, theoretically.
Yeah.
So like what kind of things should I look out for to make sure they don't cancel, I guess?
Yeah, there are instances where a seller could cancel. I mean, I had a deal like a few weeks ago that the seller pulled out at closing. So we were about to close and make $15,000 as an assignment fee, and the seller just got cold feet and didn't want to sell.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, we could have gone forward and we could have enforced the contract, and we could have enforced what's called specific performance, which states that, hey, we can now hold the seller liable to uphold their end of the agreement, because we were completely non-contingent in the deal. We had money on the line at risk, and we were ready to close, and they were holding up their side of the deal. So their lender wasn't providing the right payoff information to the title company. So the title company didn't know how much to pay the lender and how much to pay the seller once we paid the purchase price. So it was on their end, the seller was delaying and their side of the transaction. So we could have taken action and actually like closed the deal. But we like to do the right thing. We like to act with integrity.
Yeah.
We don't want to force anyone to do anything. That's just not how we run our business. I think other wholesalers might have taken legal action to close the deal, but we're just like, hey, like we have a reputation to uphold. Reputation's everything to us at least. So
It's just the right thing to do.
It's the
So,
right
yeah.
thing to do.
Yeah,
So we're just like, all right, well, we're going to cancel.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it was just because they got cold feet, and
Yeah.
a lot of times we are dealing with distressed sellers who aren't very like organized and who don't really understand real estate transactions. And
Yeah.
like it's a very big decision,
Yeah.
like buying and selling a house is like one of the most important decisions, and has very big financial consequences.
Yeah.
And you're honestly moving your entire life. So sellers can get cold feet,
Yeah.
I would say is like probably one of the biggest reasons why they might want to cancel. It is possible that they get higher offers later too. They might have other people sending offers, and they could get a higher offer later, and so they might get cold feet as a result of that. So
the more offers you send, the closer you are to the deal, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So getting back to
I think
the deposits.
line 6 now.
Yeah. So 6, again, if you're offering all cash, then you can pretty much cross out item 6. So this is your financing contingency. If you did want to make your offer contingent on obtaining a loan, then you can actually specify the amount of that loan in this section, the maximum initial interest rate, meaning what's the most that this loan can actually charge me as far as the interest rate, and as well as the terms. So really just the terms of the financing, that if me as the buyer, if I cannot get a loan that at least meets or exceed these terms, then I can cancel the agreement. So, so again, this is an opportunity. Most people who are going to be using this contract are not going to need this financing contingency. So it's a great opportunity to cross this out and explain to the seller the strength of your offer being cash and saying, hey, you don't have to worry about me not obtaining this loan and not having the ability to qualify for a loan to buy this property. It's also not contingent on getting an appraisal of the property. So I'm not going to get an appraisal on this property. It's not a contingency of this agreement. So again, contingencies are just ways that a buyer can back out of a contract. They can terminate the agreement if that contingency is not met, and it just strengthens the offer the less contingencies you have in that contract.
Right.
So 6 really just concerns that contingency. You can read some of the details there as far as what it means. And 7 is the condition of the premises. This is simply a disclosure just saying, hey, the buyer has examined the property, they're satisfied with the physical condition, subject to the inspection contingency. So this is not the inspection contingency.
Right.
That's coming afterwards, which is one of the most important things that we as wholesalers, we as investors, really just any prudent individual buying a piece of real estate is going to want to have in their contract is an inspection contingency.
This is the big thing that protects us, right? I remember Alex mentioning that, because if it's like kind of, and high level what I think it is, if it's not up to standard, if the property isn't up to standard, to our standards, we can back out now of this.
Correct.
Because we inspected it, it's like, hey, there's actually like no second floor. It's like it got blown away with a tornado or something, like.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, just kind of like big picture. So the inspection contingency, it's basically saying, hey, when we enter this agreement, let's say you're the buyer, I'm the seller, we agree to do this deal. You typically haven't taken the time to look at every system of the property. You haven't looked at the furnace, the air conditioning, the roof. You haven't crawled underneath the house and looked at the crawl space and the foundation. You really to make sure there aren't any significant defects of this property that can significantly impact the value. So we're entering this deal, kind of on a surface level saying, hey, I love the location. I love the characteristics of this property. Everything I've seen so far, I'm willing to move forward with it, but I need to do a more thorough inspection to make sure that this isn't gonna, completely have me lose my investment, right? There's no like cracked slab and compromised framing in this property that is gonna cause a huge expense down the road, which could completely destroy the buyer financially.
Right.
So the inspection gives the buyer the right to actually go in really as many times as they need, as within reason, to inspect all the systems of the property, to do walkthroughs of the property, and to make sure that they are satisfied with the physical condition of the property before they're formally and officially committed to buying the property.
Right.
So what this does, it effectively makes your deposit on this deal, your earnest money deposit, it's refundable until you remove all your contingencies. So as wholesalers, right, entering a real estate wholesale contract, this is an important thing to protect your earnest money deposit because your cash buyers, like someone's going to want to inspect the property before they're formally committed to it.
Yeah.
So you're going to want to make sure you have as long as you can possibly negotiate to inspect the property because that's your protection of your earnest money. It protects you and it gives you more of an opportunity to now, market the property, to find the right buyer for the property and to really show it to prospective end buyers.
Yeah.
So it's not only, serves as the physical inspection, which is really what it's mainly for, but it's also an opportunity for you to shop the deal around to potential cash buyers, to end buyers for your contract.
Yeah.
So that
you're kind of gathering all the information as you're inspecting it, finding the exact perfect buyer for it. Would it be kind of common, and is it even possible then for the cash buyer to kind of do this part, do the inspection on your behalf? Like, say you have a really good relationship, you guys work together all the time. It's like, hey, like I got the property in XYZ LA. Like, can you just go see it for me? Like, is that totally legal, totally doable?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the thing I love about this particular contract too is that it's very explicit that you as the buyer can now have your designees inspect the property, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So it's very specifically stating that anyone that I designate to go do this inspection, whether it's a partner, whether it's a contractor, whether it's an actual home inspector or not, anyone that I designate can go do an inspection on this property. So yeah, great question, absolutely. Especially when we're wholesaling in other states and doing this at a distance, we'll have somebody else go check out the property. And typically it's our cash buyer.
Right.
It's someone who's actually interested in being the end buyer of this property. We'll arrange that they go and inspect the property. They'll usually do one walkthrough and they're able to make a decision after that walkthrough.
Yeah. So I imagine they really want to if they're going to be the ones kind of making the investment to purchase it and resell it, right?
Totally, yeah. I mean, we'll vet them up front and just make sure, hey, does this deal numbers-wise work for you? Obviously subject to your walkthrough, but you like the property, you like the price, just do some vetting, make sure that they're serious before you actually get them to the property. But again, yeah, this inspection we often use it as the time for our buyers to go through and based on their walkthrough, they can give us a non-contingent commitment to buying the property. So you're generally going to want to assign this contract or secure your end buyer within your inspection contingency. So this is very important because otherwise you're pretty much locked into the deal. Right. And if you don't close it, then your earnest money is going to be at risk, and you might have even more of a risk if you don't have a great contract like what we have here.
Right.
So yeah, this is a very important contingency. And so, I mean, I'll just go over really quick because it is a very important thing, and I want to make sure you understand and everyone else understands what this actually means in practice. So 8A of the inspection contingency just means that the inspections shall be completed and results reported to seller on or before 5 p.m. on a given date. So this sets your time frame for your inspection contingency, your inspection period of your real estate wholesale contract. So let's say we enter the contract on January 1st. You might write, January 14th as the completion date for your inspection. So that effectively gives you a 14-day inspection period, which would allow you to investigate the property, determine whether you're satisfied with the condition of the property, right? Learn things about the property that you might have not known otherwise, and then also shop the deal to your buyers, get your cash buyers inside of the property, and then secure your commitment by one of your cash buyers during that period. So 8A is really setting that deadline to complete your inspections. 8B is saying that the seller agrees to permit buyer's designees to inspect the real property during the period from seller's acceptance until the date set forth in 8A above. If buyer is not satisfied with the physical condition of the real property and so notifies seller in writing prior to the date specified in A above, then buyer may, at buyer's option, terminate this agreement. So that is one of the most important lines here to protect you as a wholesaler, and that gives you the right to terminate the agreement and no risk involved. You get your earnest money deposit back, and you can walk away from this contract as if it never happened. Of course, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to get the experience, which is absolutely worth something. But this is super important, which is why I want everyone to really study this and download this, highlight this section, because this is your protection and why it should make you feel comfortable entering in contracts like this.
I can see why it's so important now. I've actually never read it line by line, and it actually really is something, pro tip, that everybody needs to have. Awesome, yeah, thank you. So 14 days, usually, right, from the time of closing. Seller allows anybody, including myself or my cash buyer, to see it on said day. And then after it's signed, we basically have 2 weeks to inspect and back out if needed.
That's if you negotiate a 14-day inspection. So that was just one example. You can make it as short or as long as is negotiable. So it benefits the buyer to have the inspection period all the way up to the date of closing, right? So that means you can back out all the way up to the date of closing, but it benefits the seller to have no inspection period at all, which means the buyer's accepting it as is with being locked in from day zero, right? So it's usually going to land somewhere in between, right? It's usually never, sometimes it's non-contingent. Sometimes it might be all the way till closing, but it's usually somewhere in between. So if you want to strengthen your offer, you want to have a shorter inspection period. But if you want to have more freedom, more flexibility, more protection, you want to have a longer inspection period. So yeah, you might want to start with like 14 days. If that's too long, then you can always just start to diminish it. Typically we'll shoot for at least like 5 days. So at least that gives us a full business week to take a look at the property, shop it around, and that's plenty of time to really find a buyer and get the deal wholesaled.
Got it. Cool.
So just moving on again, because this is really important to really understand. It says buyer may give seller the option to correct the conditions that are unsatisfactory to the buyer. Should buyer elect to terminate this agreement or seller is unwilling to correct any unsatisfactory conditions, the buyer shall notify seller on or before 5 p.m. on this date of buyer's election to terminate this agreement. And if terminated, this agreement shall be null and void, and any deposit monies paid hereunder shall be returned immediately to buyer, and neither buyer nor seller shall have any claims against each other under the terms of this agreement. So basically, it just gives the opportunity for the seller to correct any deficiencies. However, it does give a lot of leeway to the buyer to just terminate the contract and ultimately walk away from the deal. So if you still wanted the property, but you want it subject to some repairs, you have the opportunity to ask the seller to correct them. Usually investors don't do that. They'll either say, hey, take it or leave it. You might ask for a price reduction. This is another opportunity if you discover a lot of things of the property that you don't like that impact the value. Maybe your rehab cost just doubled because you discovered a foundation problem, or maybe some of the framing has been damaged by a hurricane and you need to completely replace a section of the house. So this is also an opportunity to renegotiate with the seller and get a better price for the same property because of the results of your inspection.
Right, okay, yeah.
So if you're, let's just say, I know a lot of new wholesalers, a lot of amateur wholesalers, they'll lock up properties at way too high of a price, just excited about getting a deal under contract, just saying, hey, I got something under contract, but then the price is too high and your cash buyers are saying, hey, like I need it for $50K less than what you have it.
Yeah.
So this is also your opportunity to go in, do your inspection, and then come to the seller with a case as to why you want to have a better price for the property, right? Maybe you reviewed the deal in more detail. You have all of these things that the property requires in order to sell for top dollar that wasn't disclosed by the seller to begin with.
Right.
So now you can really build a case as to why the property needs to sell for a lower price to make sense for you as an investor, for your business model. And so again, it's another opportunity to renegotiate.
and get a better price so that it works for your buyers, it works for you as a wholesaler,
Yeah.
and hopefully it works for the seller.
Yeah, that's nice. You're not, you're not backing out. You're just kind of being like, oh, that's not really like worth the price that we originally had. Let's try to work out something else, right?
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's like the agreement, you enter it, it's like a little bit surface level. The inspection is really where the rubber meets the road, where you as the buyer, you get the opportunity to put the property under a microscope and really determine what kind of repairs are needed. If you're going to be fixing and flipping the property, you're going to want to get your contractors in there. You're going to want to develop a scope of work. This is what your cash buyers are probably doing at this time too. Understanding like how much is it really going to cost to rehab this property. So 8C is if you're going to be waiving your right to an inspection, then you would initial here to waive your inspection contingency. So sometimes if we're really certain that we're going to be buying a property, whether it's going to be a wholesale, fix and flip, or rental, then we might even waive the inspection contingency, right? Just to really strengthen the offer and get it accepted by the seller. It gives the seller certainty that we're going to close, that our earnest money is non-refundable day one. So if you really want to send a strong signal to a seller that you're sure about closing and you're not playing any games, then you could waive your inspection. I wouldn't recommend this to any first timer. So I wouldn't recommend you waiving your inspection for all the reasons we just talked about.
Yeah.
But that's in there in case someone wants to really make a statement and show the seller that there's very few ways that the buyer can actually walk away from this agreement.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. So yeah, number 9, it's just the lead-based paint disclosure. This has been required for a very long time. It's really just letting people know that some properties have lead-based paint, which can be toxic. And so just so people know it's in there, nothing that you need to do there. Number 10 is important. It's the occupancy, possession, and closing date. So when is this deal going to close? Right. So you might enter a contract on January 1st. When is this transaction going to settle? When is the closing date? So that would be specified here, as well as stating that the buyer shall be receiving possession and occupancy with keys on closing date. So this just means that the seller can't hang out for a week after you close, right? So a lot of times sellers will want to stay in properties after you close so that they get the money and then they can figure out, hey, where am I moving next? But this states that the property is going to be delivered vacant. It's going to be, occupancy is going to be transferring, possessions transferring to the buyer at closing, and that it should be delivered in broom clean condition, free of debris. I mean, you'd be surprised how messy some properties are that we'll get at closing. And it says buyers should have the right to a walkthrough inspection of the property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. So to your point earlier, you mentioned, hey, there might be a hurricane or like a flood that comes through the property. This just makes sure that, from the date that you sign this contract, right until the day of closing, that the property hasn't, caught fire or the roof hasn't been blown off by a hurricane and it's flooded. So you want to make sure that it is in the same condition as when you went under contract.
Yeah.
So this just gives you, the buyer, the right to another walkthrough within 48 hours prior to the closing date to make sure that it's still in decent shape.
Yeah.
It's also an opportunity to state the title and escrow company that's going to be handling the transaction. So you might want to choose an investor-friendly title company for your wholesale contract, for your wholesale deal. So if you have a company that you want to specify, you can go ahead and put that here so that there's no question. If you don't yet have your title company or escrow company or attorney selected, then you could just simply say buyer's choice in that space, so that once you have the executed agreement, it's now your choice who you want to go to. So that's one way that you could complete that section if you're
But it's always kind of recommended to use one of those things, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So it is important to understand if your state, wherever you're going to be doing the real estate transaction, wherever the property is located, if attorneys are closing these wholesale deals, if a title company is the sole party who's handling the transaction, or if it's a combination of title and escrow like in California, for example, it's a title company and an escrow company. In states like, Chicago or like Illinois, right? I've done a lot of deals in Chicago. It's handled by attorneys. In Colorado, for example, we just closed some deals in Colorado. It's only a title company. So it's important for wholesalers, before entering into real estate contracts or doing deals, just understand what are the local customs, talk to people in your market, understand who handles the closings, and so that you can start to create some connections and get some referrals so that you can specify an investor-friendly attorney, investor-friendly title company to put on the contract ahead of time. Yeah.
So me, let's just say I want to wholesale something in San Diego. How would I kind of go about finding a good title? Is there one you recommend? A good title company?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends really. Again, like where the deal is going to be. Are you asking like for a specific title company or just like how to go about
let's just
finding
say
one?
like I'm like, hey Ryan, like I got this deal like under contract. Like I come to you tomorrow and it's let's just say here San Diego, like La Jolla or something. Like,
there's a handful that I've worked with in the past. I know Chicago Title is like a national company. That's
so there's national ones.
Really,
that's cool.
There's national title companies that have branches all over the country. So there's Chicago Title. There's Western Resources Title. There's Fidelity National Title.
Yeah. It's pretty easy to find, I guess.
Yeah, there's Ticor Title. There's Lawyers Title. There's tons of title companies.
Yeah.
So there's a plethora. There's so many options to choose from.
Yeah.
But I would recommend, talk to other wholesalers. Talk to a mentor in your area. Talk to investors in your area. Just to understand, hey, who would you recommend working with for this type of transaction? Who responds well? Who's on top of things? Who does good work?
Yeah.
So it's a people business. So a lot of times you're just going to want to work with people that like and trust, or who've been referred to you.
Yeah. Thankfully, there's a community here that's very active and very, very helpful. Who can kind of help me, throughout this whole thing. So
yeah, absolutely. Anywhere that you're looking to do deals, we've probably worked with a company there, or we know people who are doing deals there who could point you in the right direction. Yeah.
Nice, awesome. All right, so where did we leave off? Line.
Yeah, we're on 11. So we're going through the whole thing. So I think it's important again, using these contracts just to at least know at a high level. 11 is just basically saying that you're receiving title to the property as a warranty deed. So essentially it's just a way that a seller can convey ownership to their property. There's different types of ownership involved, so I wouldn't even worry about this section. This basically says that the seller's gonna be transferring full and unconditional title to you as the buyer. It's not like a lease. It's not a leasehold interest. It's not a partial interest. It's just they're transferring the deed, which is the ownership interest of the property, to you as the buyer at closing. It also says that the seller doesn't warrant or has no knowledge of any outstanding violations or any clouds or encumbrances on title that could impact their ability to transfer the title to the buyer. So that kind of goes into the next section, marketable title. So you might hear this term in wholesale contracts and just real estate contracts in general. We always recommend including a clause like this in any of your real estate wholesale contracts, or whatever you're doing in real estate. If you're buying a piece of property, you want to make sure that the seller delivers free and clear marketable title, which ultimately means that it's not encumbered by any kind of liens, back taxes, code violations, tax liens, or loans, mechanics liens. So like a contractor who files a lien on the property, like these things need to be cleared by the seller before you take over the property. So you as the buyer, you don't want to take over a property that has a bunch of different liens on it that you now have to pay. These are essentially financial obligations that are tied to the title of the property, to the ownership. So it needs to be marketable, or else the buyer can actually cancel the contract. So this actually in effect acts as another contractual contingency in the contract. So normally, most of the time, sellers are able to deliver marketable title. They're able to clear the liens. They're able to transfer the property. They're going to pay off their mortgage, pay off the taxes, pay off the utilities, anything that other people might own. They might have a family member who lien the property to pay for expenses, whatever that might be. The seller needs to clear all those, and so the property transfers to the buyer just clean and clear. So if they're unable to do that, if they can't satisfy those liens, then the buyer has the right to walk away, receive their earnest money deposit back, and cancel the agreement.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Or they might agree to take it over, right? You could always renegotiate the price at that point, right? You could always get creative. So it gives the buyer the right to walk away or figure out a way forward, is what this really means.
Got it.
So it's almost like a title contingency. in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
So number 13 is regarding adjustments and proration. So simply put, there are property taxes that are being paid on the property. There are utility bills. There are potentially rents being collected on the property. So there's money being paid, and there might be income coming in, which normally is billed monthly, right? Rent is paid monthly. Utility bills are paid monthly. But when you close on a property in the middle of the month, then you're going to need to prorate that amount so that either the buyer is going to have to pay for whatever they're taking over, right? If they buy it on the 15th of the month, then they'll have to pay from the 15th to the end of the month of whatever bills are in question.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially just prorating down to the day of how much property taxes that the seller owes and how much that the buyer owes, as well as any other types of interest on the property, assessments, things like that. So it just lists a number of different types of expenses as well that will be prorated at closing depending on when you actually close.
Mm-hmm.
So you might notice if you close on one day as opposed to another, your closing costs might fluctuate depending on the actual close date because of some of these fees, right? Because every day that goes on, the seller or the owner of the property is paying utilities, taxes, insurance, all of these things. So depending on when you close, you're either going to pay more or less of that depending on what date of the month that you're closing on.
Got it.
Yeah, and same goes with rents, right? If you're buying a tenanted property, you're going to receive so much of the rent that's already been paid for that month. And so yeah, it's just going to be stating that it's prorated down to the day. It also says that the security deposits as well from tenants are going to be transferred to the buyer or credited to the buyer at closing. So if you have tenants, they have the right to their security deposits. So now the buyer is going to be receiving those and is now responsible for those deposits. So that's really what this 13 paragraph is all about. So 14 is buyer's default. So paragraph 14 in our wholesale contract is buyer's default. This is super important for everyone to really understand what it means, no matter what contract you're using to wholesale. Is you need to understand what happens if you don't perform on the wholesale contract, right? What if you enter the contract and you just walk away and go to Hawaii and just forget about it, right? There are consequences, and this is what it talks about here. So basically it just says that if buyer fails to comply with any of the terms in the agreements and as well as the timelines, and if the seller is not in default, then the seller shall be entitled to all initial and additional deposits provided for in Section 4. So this is that initial deposit, the earnest money. And so it basically gives the seller the right to keep that deposit if the buyer doesn't perform on the contract. And there's an important term in here called liquidated damages. So it says, seller shall be entitled to all initial and additional deposit funds provided for in Section 4, whether or not buyer has paid the same as liquidated damages, and both parties shall be relieved of further liability under this agreement. So what that term means, this is a very important term in contracts to look out for, and why I'm really glad it's in our contract here, is that it limits both parties' liability in this contract, right? The financial consequence of defaulting on this contract, it limits it to the amount of the deposit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not any more than that.
Not
That's-
anymore.
yeah,
So if you put $1,000 as your earnest money deposit,
that's really all you lost.
the ceiling of financial consequence, the limit of damages is $1,000, whatever you have in that in your contract. So they cannot pursue you for $100,000, right? So that's why it's really important to have them there. Otherwise, they could come after you for as much as they want, right?
Yeah.
Anyone can sue anyone for anything in America. So,
Well, that's really good. This really does cover everything. I mean, that's like the third thing now I didn't even think about that I need to be covered for. You know, 'cause there's so many like legal holes that I feel like beginner wholesalers like don't really think of, but this kind of has the catch-all realistically
For sure,
all,
yeah.
all the bad things that could happen. Yeah,
and that's why that's why we're taking the time to go through it.
yeah,
Because if you're a beginner wholesaler, or even if you're just looking for a new wholesale contract, having one as strong as this is going to protect you, but also understanding what's in it is going to allow you to feel comfortable and confident when you're in these situations, when you're down to the wire and you're trying to wholesale this deal on the last day of the inspection.
Yeah.
Like, you want to know with confidence that you're protected, because I see a lot of newer wholesalers that get worried, on the first day of the inspection, they have a week left and they're freaking out because they don't have a buyer yet. So it's really helpful to know what your potential risk is, which is what paragraph 14 buyer default is all about. The last sentence there just says if there's any legal action brought forth as part of this agreement, then the prevailing party shall be entitled to reasonable attorney's fees. So you would just get reimbursed for any attorney's fees if you're the party that basically wins any kind of legal action, any kind of lawsuit as part of this. 15 is just risk of loss damage. So it's basically, again, going back to if there's any damage to the property, if there's any loss on the property, right? If there's a fire, for example, during the contract period, that if the buyer didn't cause that damage, of course, right, that the seller is responsible for that, right? They still own the property, so it's not the buyer's fault. If the damage exceeds $5,000, then the buyer shall have the option to receive any insurance payment on account of said damage and take title, or rescind the agreement and receive back all the deposit money paid. So again, this is kind of like a contingency in a way, basically saying if there is any damage or loss on the property, that it gives the buyer the right to cancel, to walk away, or potentially continue to move forward and receive any insurance proceeds as a result to help remediate any of that damage. So again, very, very rare that this would actually come into play, but it's just, again, more protection for buyers, more protection for wholesalers in these contracts that we want to have in here to protect our interests, right? So 16, not super important. If you're buying a condo or if you're in an HOA, that's what a common interest community really means. When there's another governing body organizing the neighborhood, then it just says the seller will deliver the appropriate documents according to the local statutes and customs. So some HOAs require them to get involved in the transaction and to approve of sales and things like that. So it just has the seller comply with any local customs and rules. Cool. Well, we are getting close to being done, but we're almost there. So 17 is listing broker. So in the case that this is listed with a listing broker, it might be a pocket listing, it might be on the MLS, then you would simply disclose who that listing broker is, what their phone number is, and then if there's dual agency, right? If the listing broker is representing both seller and buyer, you can simply just check that box. And if there is a cooperating broker, which that just means if there's a broker representing you as the buyer, then you would just put their information here as well. Again, usually you're working directly with the seller on a contract like this, but if there are agents involved, we love working with real estate agents. They have access to a lot of great deals, and so we want to just make sure that they're listed on these contracts as well.
right.
18 is mandatory seller disclosures. So every state has different local disclosures involved in real estate transactions. So this just states that the seller shall deliver to the buyer within time specified by statute, so in accordance with local laws, within 7 days of the acceptance of the offer. So a lot of times sellers, they're required to provide disclosure reports, basically stating if there's any deficiencies with the properties, any recent repairs made, any reoccurring problems or issues that they're aware about. They're required to disclose these things to the buyer. They can't just throw some dirt on it and pretend like it doesn't exist, right? They've got to disclose things to the buyers just as as it applies to local laws. So this is a big part of real estate, is disclosures from sellers to buyers. So this just requires that in accordance with local laws, the seller shall provide it to the buyer. And if the seller fails to deliver those disclosures, then the buyer has some protections as well. 19, equal housing rights. There's a lot of equal fair housing rights, all over the nation. And this just basically saying that it's subject to any local or national laws about, fair housing laws, equal housing rights. So again, just another disclosure that we wanted to put in here. 20 is for any additional addenda and advisories. So it's just a space that if you had any additional addenda or advisories, you can just list them here. So then they would become an attachment. They would become part of this agreement as well. So you can just state them here. For example, if the seller is a trust, a lot of times they have to disclose that the seller is a trust, or if it's an entity, there may be some additional addenda to specify who's behind that entity or who's behind the trust. So again, just some things that you can add here. We just kind of left this open so you can add things as well. 21, additional terms and conditions. It's always good to have this section in your contract in case there are things that aren't specifically addressed in this contract. Terms that you're negotiating with the seller. For example, the buyer might offer to pay for moving costs for the seller, maybe outside of escrow, to help with the move, to really facilitate the sale and really solve the seller's needs, solve the seller's problems, and help them with this big decision in their lives. So you can add additional terms, really just a blank section, whatever you like. Of course, it's always good to get an attorney or someone experienced involved when you're ever making additions.
Your own.
Yes, exactly. So
Tim said he would give me his car. Oops.
Yep. And then, of course, there's initials for both parties on every page. And really the rest is just talking about, notices and how, emails or fax might be, acceptable, as well as, how you're going to communicate between both parties. A complete agreement just simply means that this is the entire agreement. Whatever we talked about verbally does not apply. This is the entire agreement, and everything in here is the full, contract between the parties. 24 is about notice. So it's just saying that notices shall be in writing between the two parties. And, that's pretty much what that says here. 25, disclosures and contract provisions. Seller acknowledges that the buyer has the right to market the property and or contractual interest in the property in any way before closing. Seller understands upon signing this agreement that buyer will possess a contractual interest in the property. So this is a very important contractual disclosure for wholesaling. This is why one of the reasons why this is a great wholesaling contract that we want people to use, we want people to review as a template, because this allows the wholesaler, this allows the buyer to now market the property or the contract to then find that end buyer. So this is a disclosure letting the seller know that yes, we are wholesaling. Yes, we have the right to do so. Maybe we will buy the property, right? It's entirely possible, but this just gives the buyer the right, the flexibility to now, market the property, market the contract prior to closing. And the seller's agreeing to it here. 26 is short sale. So if this is a short sale, then this is basically just a disclosure here for that. 27, it's always important if you, Tim, as a buyer, if you're a licensed realtor, you've got to disclose that. If anyone's using this contract who is a licensed real estate agent, you would want to disclose that as well. So this is just an opportunity to do so. If no licenses are at play, then nothing is needed in this section. And then 28, it's just an acknowledgement that both parties have the power and ability to enter the agreement. They've read and understand the agreement and voluntarily accept the duties and obligations set forth herein. Buyer shall deliver a copy of this agreement to the seller within 7 days. So again, just another acknowledgement. And then finally, time to accept. When you're presenting the offer to the seller, this acts as a deadline. So it says, hey, I'm giving you this offer today. There's a timeline to where I might pull the offer, right? We're looking at 10 other houses right now to purchase, and I need to commit my capital to a certain number of these. I might be buying 5 before the end of the month, so I need to know if we're committed by this certain date. So it puts a little bit of pressure, but also just allows this offer to have an expiration date so that it's not just out there forever. So usually you want to put 48, 72 hours. You might put as much as maybe 5 days to a week. So at least there's a timeline so the seller doesn't just forget about it and pretend like they can hold this in hand forever and go out and shop a bunch of other offers. And then finally, signatures, extremely important. This contract is not valid without signatures, so make sure you get all of the seller's signatures on the lines here as well as the date. So if there's multiple parties, again, multiple sellers involved, you want all of their signatures here, or else you might have a problem actually closing this deal, as well as your own signature. And again, I'll remind you that there are initials pages on every single page. There's initial blocks on every page at the bottom. So go ahead and initial all of them. And once you've completed that, you now have an executed purchase and sale agreement.
Hey, we did it. A couple questions really quick though. Okay, so this is technically when I'm like offering on a property, quote unquote, when I'm sending offers. Alex says it all the time. You guys say it all the time. Sending offers. It's this pretty much.
Yep. This is an offer contract.
Got it.
So
Okay.
you will fill this out as the buyer and as complete as you can with all of your signatures.
Yeah.
You will hand this to the seller and explain it to them and go over with them. And if they accept, they will also sign it.
Yeah.
And so once they sign it, you now have what we call an executed purchase agreement. And so that is a valid binding agreement at that point. And so once you have that signed, you can now take it to a title company to open escrow. They can now start running their title reports to understand if this is really the owner of the property, just double confirming that. They're able to look up if there's any liens in the property, et cetera, et cetera. They'll handle your earnest money deposit.
I was just about to follow up with that. Yeah, so the earnest money deposits after technically this has been signed and completed by both parties. It's given to title and escrow. They handle your EMD and all the legal kind of stuff in here to protect you and the seller, whoever is in the contract itself. Got it.
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
So let's just say everything with them goes well. Is this sent back to us then? And then we technically would have to do this. So I guess my question would be like, the assignment addendum, is that also sent with the purchase and sale agreement to escrow too? Or is this kind of separate in that kind of step for wholesaling?
Yeah, so this is step number 1, the purchase and sale agreement. So you can't have an assignment agreement without having this first. So you will, once you have a fully signed copy, you definitely want to make sure you have all the signatures in place. Make a copy of it, and then you send the copy to the title company.
Got it.
You want to send a copy to the seller so everybody has it. And as soon as you have that, you can now get your assignment agreement in play. So now you have something to assign, right? Without having a purchase agreement, you cannot assign anything because you don't have an interest in the property. You don't have a contractual interest. So I think a lot of like newbie wholesalers, they'll think that, hey, I found a property, now I can wholesale it, right? Like you have to send offers and get those offers accepted to then be able to wholesale the property via an assignment. So it's not just about finding the deals, it's also about knowing how to structure your wholesale contract, get it accepted, and then now you have an asset which you can now monetize.
Right. So with this completed, let's say everything goes well, it's sent back to me. Now I have the legal right to assign it to anybody I want, most likely my cash buyer, and that's this baby right here.
Exactly, yeah. So fortunately, the assignment addendum is a one-pager.
Yeah, I noticed that.
It's very simple. It's a lot easier to understand. But you need to have a strong one, and you need to have one that serves your interests as a wholesaler, protects the deal. So
yeah, can we walk me through kind of this part of the wholesale contract, the assignment addendum?
Yep, absolutely. So this is simply a one-pager to where you are now considered the assignor. So you are the assignor, and your cash buyer, the end buyer, is the assignee. So once you have your cash buyer who's ready to go, who likes the deal, They may need to set eyes on it most of the time. They might have to do their walkthrough, like we talked about. Once they're ready to go, then you will send them this assignment addendum to now memorialize their commitment to purchasing the property under the terms of your original agreement. So what the assignment addendum will do is transfer your rights to this new to the new buyer in exchange for a assignment fee. So we can just walk through this as well, just so everybody knows how to fill it out. Again, this is available for download, so the best way to get the most out of this walkthrough is just to have it in front of you, print it out just like we did here, and so you can even fill it out as we go along. So the assignment addendum is between the assignor, which would be the contract holder. Let's say Tim is the purchaser on the purchase agreement, and then me, Ryan, I am the assignee. Let's say I'm the end buyer, okay? So you're the assignor, I'm the assignee. We put our names there or our business entities. So your name needs to match what's on the purchase agreement because that's who has the right to buy that property. So the assignor and assignee, when mentioned together, may be referred to as the parties. So we're now the parties of this agreement. On the day of the month of the year, you would simply put the date that you entered into the contract. The same date that's on your contract, the assignor entered into a purchase agreement with the seller as the sellers and the assignor as the buyers for the right to purchase the property located at, and then you put your address. So again, this is where you just want to make sure the parties are aligning with your original purchase agreement. The date is the same. So you're essentially identifying what contract you're assigning in this section and who are the parties involved in that original agreement. So again, make sure the address is right and make sure there's no typos or anything wrong.
Really quick, does the day, so on the day of year, does that need to match with anything on here, the purchase agreement?
Yeah, so if there is a date of the agreement itself, sometimes it's stated at the top of the agreement, but if not, then I would put the last day that it was signed. So whenever it was the effective date, so when the seller signs the purchase agreement is basically the effective date of the contract.
Right, and so it'll be the same thing on this
Yeah,
one. Cool.
So that's officially when like the contract is formed, and so you would want to go ahead and use that date. Sometimes like in realtor purchase agreements, they will have a date that the contract is actually written at the top, which might be different from when it was actually accepted. So in that scenario, I would use the date that the contract was written, but you could also use the effective date, which is when the seller actually accepts it.
Got it.
So in this case, you would use the date the seller accepts it, which is when they entered into the purchase agreement. You would list the sellers there, as well as the assignor, which in this case would be you, Tim. And a copy of the agreement has been attached and can be furnished upon request. Again, we're referring to the purchase agreement. Assigner wishes to sell their rights and interest in the purchase agreement, and the assignee wishes to buy all of the assigner's rights and interest and accepts receiving title and interest in the property. In exchange, the assignee agrees to be responsible for and paying the assignor an assignment fee of, and then this is where the magic happens. You get to decide how much you want to charge as far as the assignment fee. So how much would you like to put here? How much are you going to charge me for this deal, Tim, to take over this property?
$10,000. A modest yet good fee for myself.
Absolutely. I'd say that's very fair.
Yeah.
Great opportunity. So this is where you would state your assignment fee. So also known as the wholesale fee, your wholesale assignment fee, that would specifically go there. So $, down to the penny, you want to list it there on or before the closing or settlement date. If the assignment fee is paid at closing and through escrow, this fee shall be made out to the assignor on the HUD settlement statement. So this sentence right here basically gives you the right to receive your assignment fee through the title company, through the escrow company, right? You're going to be on the settlement statement, which I think is great for a number of reasons. You'll get paid as soon as the transaction closes, right? The seller's going to get their money, and at the same time, you're also going to get your assignment fee. So So it is important to fill this out. The title company will get this agreement so that they can also pay it through the closing of the transaction. You're going to be listed on the buyer's, my side of the settlement statement, and so that's good. Also, it's good as a wholesaler, as you're building your track record, it's good to be on the settlement statements so that you can now show that you're building a track record of closing deals, of being involved in acquisitions. So you're not just like a ghost as far as the deals you're doing. Like you have a paper trail of some of the deals you're doing. So when you're raising money from a hard money lender, a private money lender, transaction lender, you can now demonstrate that you've been involved in real estate deals. So something that I think some wholesalers miss. Ultimately, it's better to get paid than not. But if you can be on the HUDs, on the settlement statements, then I would opt to do so.
Yeah, I imagine after my first wholesale fee, I'll want to do it again. So yeah, kind of good for me to build that reputation using those lines right there. Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So moving on. Furthermore, the assignee agrees to pay a non-refundable deposit to the assignor due at the execution of this assignment of blank dollars. Right. You can put however much you want there, which is refundable only if the title is not clear and conveyable. This deposit is a credit towards the assignment fee. This assignment is not effective until the deposit is paid and both parties sign this assignment addendum. So what is this non-refundable deposit? So the assignment fee would be due at closing. However, if I like to use this non-refundable deposit as a way for the person, the end buyer, the person I'm assigning this contract to put their money where their mouth is, so that they are now, we might, if it's a $10,000 assignment fee, we might ask for $5,000 non-refundable up front, which is paid immediately to make this assignment agreement effective. So they are now committed non-refundable into this deal, $5,000, which for me, it might cover my earnest money deposit, and then some, right? It might be my profit. So that way, if they don't close on this deal, I'm still getting paid, or you're still getting paid on this wholesale deal because they've already put money into this property.
Yeah.
So this is a protection again. If you've submitted non-refundable money to the seller, or if you just want to make sure this buyer is going to close, this is an opportunity for them to put money up to make this assignment effective, especially if it's your first time working with a cash buyer and you don't have a relationship with them. Then you just want to make sure that they're going to perform and they have some skin in the game, because otherwise, what do they have to lose?
Right.
So, and then and it's important to mention that it's a credit towards the assignment fee. So even if you put $5,000 there, the total assignment fee is going to be whatever you put on that first line. So if it was $10,000 assignment fee, $5,000 non-refundable deposit, then they would owe the balance of $5,000 at closing. So it's a credit towards the assignment fee. All right, so the terms and conditions are really just some more protections. I'll just run through it real quick just so we can get through this entire agreement. The parties agree to the following terms and conditions. 1, assignee is agreeing to all terms, clauses, and conditions of the purchase agreement, and by executing this assignment below, is agreeing to be liable for any and all of assignor's obligations and liabilities in the purchase agreement. Further, assignee hereby agrees to indemnify and hold assignor harmless from any claims, fees, expenses, costs, demands, liabilities, or obligations related to this assignment, the purchase agreement, and the property. So what that essentially means is that the cash buyer, right, me in the scenario, whoever's taking over the contract, is agreeing to everything in the original purchase agreement. And they are agreeing to be liable for any and all obligations, liabilities, right, financial and otherwise in that original purchase agreement. And it's also saying that cash buyer is agreeing to hold harmless and indemnify the wholesaler for any of those that we listed, right? Any fees, claims, expenses, liabilities. So they're just like waiving liability for the wholesaler. So very important clause to have in here. Number 2, this is also very important to have in your assignment agreement. Assignee hereby agrees to close on the property per the purchase agreement on or before the closing date, right? You want to enter the closing date of your purchase agreement in this section. If assignee doesn't close by this date, assignor shall have the right in their sole discretion to terminate this agreement, assign the purchase agreement to a third party, purchase the property, and take legal action against assignee for any and all damages or liability this causes. Further, assignee agrees to forfeit their deposit to assignor. Should assignor fail to act timely and take the above actions, the parties agree that assignor retains and is not waiving said rights and interest. So again, just in more simple terms, this just has the assignee agree to close by the closing date, and then if they don't close by the agreed upon date, you as the wholesaler now have the ability to take back that contract and reassign it to a different buyer, or you might decide to close on it yourself. Or if there's any consequences as a result of not being able to perform, this gives you the ability to take legal action against that cash buyer for dropping the ball and not performing their end of the deal. So, and again, it also just reinstates that their deposit was non-refundable and the wholesaler can certainly keep it. So, and lastly, 3, assignee has reviewed the purchase agreement and assignee fully understands the terms and conditions of this assignment addendum. So very simple. Again, we've used this exact assignment addendum with real estate purchase agreements, with the agreement that we have here with realtor contracts, and it's a fantastic assignment addendum, very simple to understand. But love to hear if you have any questions or anything that.
I mean, honestly, it's very thorough, and I'm glad that it's very thorough. And you kind of went kind of really deep into why everything is important in here. Personally, just being as a beginner, I don't think I'm going to use any other wholesale contract, at least, besides this one for now. Like, there are a lot of things that I didn't even think about, that need to be included. One, in this one, purchase and sale agreement to protect me and the seller, but then this one, it's like me and the buyer too, which is equally as important, right? So I guess before I, kind of go out and do my first wholesale deal with these contracts, any beginner tips that you have, any maybe like horror stories of like things that went wrong, things that you wish you would have known when you started first wholesaling about the contracts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I would read through it multiple times again. I know there's a lot of information. It can get really dry, and sometimes I'll catch myself reading a wholesale real estate contract and just kind of like space out because it's just very dull legal language. But review it a few times, highlight the sections, ask questions. Practice filling it out a few times, just so that. It's so important, because when you're talking with a seller, when you're talking with an agent, the more you know about the contract, the more confident you'll appear, the more the more you'll be able to negotiate a better deal, just knowing the ins and outs of the contract.
Right.
Because signing a contract is a big deal for a seller. Sometimes there's these mental blocks, and your confidence in the contract, your ability to explain these in layman's terms to somebody else, not only helps you learn, Tim, but it also helps the seller get more comfortable in actually signing the agreement and actually doing the deal with you.
Yeah.
So if you're not confident about what's in this contract and being able to enter an agreement with the seller, then why would the seller be confident about signing a deal with you over someone who is very confident and can explain everything and make them feel at ease with one of the biggest decisions of their entire life in many cases, right?
Yeah.
So I would just say, take your time, print out a few copies if you need to, like practice filling it out as an example. And then, ask questions from us, of course, from people in our community, mentors, real estate agents, attorneys, whoever really, to help you feel comfortable when you're making offers. Because this really is one of the most frequently used pieces of paper, agreements that you're going to be using as a wholesaler, as an investor. So, really take the time to understand it, and how how to creatively structure offers to cater to sellers' needs too. I think a lot of newer investors, newer wholesalers, when they're structuring their wholesaling contracts, they'll focus only on price. And that's like the main thing that they'll focus on. But in order to get your deals accepted, your offers accepted by sellers, you have to go deeper than just the number. Of course, that's a big part of it. And sometimes that's the most important thing. But if you don't dig deeper and really understand the seller's situation, right? Why are they selling? Why are they moving? Is it voluntary? Is it involuntary? Where are they going to go next? How can you help solve their biggest concerns over selling? What are their biggest pain points with this whole process?
Right.
So if you can structure things outside of price, such as helping them with moving costs or even allowing them to stay in the property for 2 weeks after closing, or various things like that that you can structure to really meet their needs with this transaction, then that's going to put you ahead of 9 out of 10 other wholesalers and investors who might be making a similar offer but haven't taken the time to go a few layers deeper.
Who aren't thinking about them,
Right.
And really, at the end of the day, I feel like it's very important to think about all three parties: buyer, yourself, and the seller being, equally as important as the money you're getting from the buyer, right? So the fact that all of that is in here, to cater to any of the seller's needs is actually really good, because if they can stay for another 2 weeks because they don't have a place to live, that might be actually worth like $5 more grand to them, that they're going to pay you, So that's, that's a really good tip. You mentioned attorneys looking it over. Does that usually cost money? Is it easy to find one who deals with real estate contracts or wholesale contracts like this? I guess, in our state, California, but in any state in the U.S.
Yeah, in some states it's required to use attorneys for your real estate agreements. Like, for example, Illinois is one where you actually work with an attorney. They build in an attorney review period into the contracts a lot of the time, so that it acts almost like a contingency to where you actually review it with your attorney.
Right.
So in those states, like, that's just part of the transaction, and then the attorney actually closes the deal. So you'll inherently have an attorney involved in the transaction the whole time. In other states like California, it's not very common to have an attorney involved in transactions. However, it's always advised. It's interesting because, as an agent myself, as an investor, like, agents aren't really allowed to give legal advice. However, when you're working with contracts, like, you kind of are acting in some capacity like a lawyer.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is pretty easy to find attorneys to work with to review your contracts. If you know a licensed agent, I'm an agent myself, we have access to a legal hotline that you can always call and ask questions about contracts and legal situations between buyers and sellers. So, I've spent a lot of time, talking to lawyers that are provided as kind of part of the membership of, all the fees I have to pay to be a licensed agent. However, if you're not a licensed agent, then you probably know someone who is, and you can always ask them to leverage some of those resources. That way you can avoid paying fees. Because yes, like, attorneys do usually charge, a few $100 an hour.
Yeah.
You can talk to some good ones, but there definitely are resources online that you can find attorneys pretty quickly, and they can either customize contracts for you or review existing contracts.
Yeah.
And they can at least help you, add terms or help you really understand what certain contracts mean.
Yeah. I mean, coming from you, and if you use this contract, I'm like fairly confident it's like 80% of the way there, if not 90, and just like one final look would really like kind of solidify this deal, make me feel better and confident actually moving forward with it. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I definitely learned a lot. This was one of the biggest humps as a beginner to go through, just because of how much legal verbiage is in these contracts, but they're really important, and thank you so much for going through every line and explaining it to me and why it's there. Hopefully I can use this soon in my first wholesale deal. So yeah, thank you very much again.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tim. I appreciate you being a student of the trade and really like being interested in what we're doing here. So always happy to help you understand and go through line by line on contracts. That's what we love to help students do. And I just know how important these are, and like having the right contracts as well as knowing how to use them. This is really the lifeblood of any transaction. This is really where it happens. So yeah, appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing you close your first wholesale deal
Soon.
Awesome, guys. Well, for those of you, again, just a reminder, we have these contracts available for download for free. So go ahead and check them out. The link is in the description, or you can just go to realestateskills.com/contracts to download them there.